Hello. Okay, I'm sorry I didn't get to do one yesterday. The end of term this year has been even busier than normal. But remember, we got to the fact where she'd spoke to the Earl, said her side of the story. Obviously, she didn't have any proof that it actually was Robert. And so Richardson, the butler, shoved her out and already had Mrs. Gilbert coming up to the house, so she knew she was going to get told off poor Clara. So here we go. Let's see if they can find evidence for Robert. Chapter 35. A stormy night. Mrs. Gilbert did not utter a single word to Clara as they walked down the hill to the gardener's cottage. Her hair was pulled into a severe bun. It exposed the pale skin near her eyes, the faint, unused laughter lines, like rusty spokes on a bicycle wheel. When Richardson had handed Clara over, Mrs. Gilbert had given him a curt nod. One of them. Richardson had given her a haughty stare in return, which had caused Mrs. Gilbert to sniff, pull Clara's arm, and steer her away from the house. As they passed the stable block, Clara saw Robert cleaning out the horse cart, stacking it with empty crates ready to be loaded with produce for the hospital. He lifted his head as they walked past. Clara lowered hers, biting the inside of her lip until it was sore. How could he let Will take the blame for something he hadn't done? Anger rose inside of her like a storm. Mr. Gilbert was waiting on the front step as they walked up the gravel path. He stepped to one side, letting Mrs. Gilbert and Clara pass through the door. He puffed out a mountainous sigh. It made Clara feel ever so slightly sick. Mrs. Gilbert led Clara into the parlour, then stood with her back to the window and fiddled with the cross she always wore around her neck, rubbing her thumb over the gold. So much had happened, and it was still only a little after 10 o'clock. Mr. Gilbert had lit a small fire. Clara had never seen the flames shiver to life in the morning before. Perhaps it meant she would be spending quite some time in this room with her aunt and uncle, discussing her wrongdoings. "So," Mr. Gilbert said in a low voice, coming to stand beside his wife, "you ran away from me and took it upon yourself to visit the Earl. This will not do, Clara. It's not how things work around here." Clara thought of Mrs. Gilbert's rules chalked onto the blackboard. She had broken all of them within a single hour. "I just wanted to help Will." "Thomas caught Will. The boy cannot be helped," Mr. Gilbert said. Clara's skin tightened. She glanced beyond Mrs. Gilbert, out of the window to a small lake. 2 swans were gliding across the water, their necks like question marks. "Why did you meet Thomas in the early morning? Give him produce from the gardens and comfort him when he cried, Mrs. Gilbert?" she asked in a rush. "Why did you write those letters, those ones in the locked room upstairs?" Mrs. Gilbert's face was almost transparent, like all the blood had leaked from it. "Frank," she whispered. Mr. Gilbert's cheeks flushed pink. Clara's eyes flickered from her aunt to her uncle and back again. "You've been in Frank's room, read my letters to him?" Mrs. Gilbert's voice was shrill. "Frank's room?" Clara asked in confusion. "He was only 6. Only 6, Mrs. Gilbert said. Her eyes were wild and bright. Clara shrank away from Mrs. Gilbert until the heat of the fire flared against the backs of her leg. "Frank was our nephew," Mr. Gilbert said. "My brother's child. Thomas's son. He came to stay with us 2 summers ago. There was an accident. Frank died. I found it hard to speak to my brother Thomas since it happened. The guilt, you see." He looked at the ceiling. "When Lizzie found out that Thomas was camping on the estate with the regiment, she decided to talk to him, to try and mend things between us." Clara nibbled on a thumbnail. The talk in Mrs. Gilbert's letter of picnics and Kitty the horse, these were all things a child had done. The person in her letter was a boy. Mrs. Gilbert sank to her knees on the rug like a deflated balloon. Mr. Gilbert kneeled beside her, placed an arm around her shoulders and stroked the stray hairs from her cheek. It was so tender it made Clara's throat ache. Mrs. Gilbert pulled away from her husband's arms, wiping her nose on a handkerchief. "We did not have children of our own, and Frank was like a son to me that summer. I suppose, though, that I suppose that those letters are a way of me dealing with my grief. When I write, it's almost as if he's still with us." Her bottom lip wobbled. "I'm sorry. Father never told me," Clara said quietly. Mrs. Gilbert glanced up. "Some things are too difficult to say." She turned her head to the window. "Frank loved those hothouses, especially when it was stormy. He would pretend that we were in a ship at sea, the rain and the wind howling and rattling the glass." She swallowed. "One evening he begged me to take him to the pineapple house. He loved it there the most. The warm, earthy smell, the plants, little heads he called them. He would speak to them, give them names. Maestro was his favourite." Maestro! The name on the piece of paper under the tapestry. The inscription on the brass plate, "Deep peace of the quiet earth." That was in memory of little Frank. The wind was fierce as we ran across the gardens. It almost happened in an instant. A branch fell from a tree near the hothouse. The Earl knew it was too close to the pineapple house. He'd been talking about removing it, and it had grown so big, but no decision had been made. His daughters liked to play in that tree, you see, and there was no sign it was unsafe. The branch hit us both, me on the leg and Frank on the head. Mrs. Gilbert rubbed her neck. "He died instantly. He did not suffer." Tears burned Clara's throat. "The Earl was devastated. He sometimes leaves fruit on the tree stump by the pineapple house, and in other places in the garden where Frank liked to play. His way of remembering, I suppose." The mandarins she and Will had found, they hadn't been connected to the fruit thief at all. The Earl had left them because he felt so terrible about Frank's death. The Earl is generous and allows us to help ourselves to the produce in the garden. I have been passing the extra vegetables to Thomas from the regiment, trying to do some good, Mrs. Gilbert said. Mr. Gilbert and Robert were worn out with the worry of stolen fruit, so Thomas offered to help, to watch the hothouse. "I'm glad he did," said Mr. Gilbert. He gave his wife a small smile, as if perhaps things between him and his brother could be mended after all. Clara cleared her throat. "I didn't mean to pry or go through your things, Mrs. Gilbert. I'm truly sorry about Frank. Mother had written to you and not me, and I thought you were hiding things." Mrs. Gilbert reached up and grasped Clara's right hand, giving it a squeeze. She pulled her down to the rug until they were sitting opposite each other. Mrs. Gilbert's fingers were icy, like they had just been dipped into a frozen pond. "I'm sorry I treated you so badly. You just reminded me of what I had lost, the responsibility of having another child stay here. I found it hard. And you should call me Aunt Elizabeth. It will be nice to hear that name again." That's why she wanted it to call Mrs. Gilbert. Her aunt's hand felt less icy now, her face a little less pale and broken. "And I did hear from your mother, Clara, but she did not write. I spoke to her on the telephone, at the big house." Her mother had not written. She'd been searching for letters that did not exist. She didn't want to write until things were more certain, Clara's uncle said gruffly. Her aunt's face flushed a rosy pink. "We've been keeping a secret from you, Clara," she said in a whisper. "About your family." Clara's insides folded in on themselves like a concertina. Her aunt stared straight into Clara's eyes. "But I think it's time you know the truth." Chapter 36. Clara's envelope. Let's see what's inside that now. The truth, the truth, the truth. The words rolled around Clara's head in time with her breaths, which were jerky, like she'd been skipping or jumping. She quickly pulled from her pocket the crumpled letter from the War Office and held it out to her aunt. Her aunt's forehead crinkled. "What's this?" I took it from the postboy just before Mother and Father left for Devon. I didn't mean to keep it, but Father was so ill and I was so worried, and then they left, and then it was too late. I was going to give it to you, but then you..." Clara paused. Clara's aunt gave her a look filled with quiet understanding. I suppose I wasn't the person I thought you thought I was. Clara gave her a brief nod. Open the letter, said Clara's aunt as she stared at the War Office stamp. Her lips were quivering. Was that because she imagined the same terrible news as Clara? She thought of Will and how he had told her there was nothing worse than not knowing the truth. She thought of how Father had told her to be brave. She had been brave. She had found Will in the cellars and confronted the Earl. Despite all of this, Clara's hands still shook as she slid a finger into the back of the envelope and slit it open. She pulled the single sheet of paper out. The typeface was blurry and swam in front of her eyes like tadpoles in a pool. Private Christopher Miller has been transferred to the Red Cross Auxiliary Hospital in Plymouth. Cautiously optimistic that with intensive rehabilitation he will make a full recovery. So that's a good sign. Clara blinked. Christopher wasn't fatally wounded. He would recover. Clara's aunt prized the letter from her fingers. We were so sorry to hear about your brother injured. Clara blinked again. You knew? The aunt nodded. The War Office sent a telegram to your parents. It wasn't as optimistic as this, and it asked them to come to Devon immediately. There had been a mix-up at the casualty clearing station in Rouen. Christopher was taken to Plymouth rather than back to your home in Kent. So Father did not go to Devon to convalesce? Father, Clara said slowly. Everything she thought had been true was now undone in her head. No, said Clara's aunt, although I think the sea air has done him a world of good. Your mother says his lungs are finally improving, so you'll be able to go home in a few days. So Clara had thought Dad and Mum had gone down to Devon to help him get better because he was getting worse and worse, but actually they went down to Devon to see her brother. And he was getting better without even having to get worse. Will had been right. If she'd been able to face her fears earlier and open the letter, she would not have wasted all this time worrying and wondering. Aunt Elizabeth reached across and placed a hand on Clara's knee. Your mother said you took it very badly when your father had gas poisoning, that it gave you terrible nightmares. They thought it was best for you to stay with us until the news was more certain. Nightmares? But those had been because of Father's stories. Or had they? Father had started telling her the bedtime stories when he had returned from France, on the nights neither of them could sleep. Had he been telling her about mountain crossing fearless explorers to make her feel braver, more able to deal with the war and all of its terribleness? She sucked in a breath and let these new thoughts settle until they felt more at home in her head. But even though most of the mysteries had been solved, the biggest one remained. But what about Will and the thief? Clara asked quietly. Her uncle shook his head. I'll hear no more talk of this now. We have proof that Will stole the fruit, Clara. I'm afraid that's all there is to it. The police will shortly be arriving to take him into town. They will charge him with theft. I'm afraid things are looking very bad for that boy indeed. Right, this is later on. It was early evening. The sky was a quiet shade of damson, a dark purpley red colour. Leaves from the apples and pear trees coated the grass in a crisp rustic carpet. A canopy, that's that word again from before, a canopy of birds chirped a soulful tune, saying goodbye to another day. Clara sat with her back to the tree trunk, closed her eyes and thought of Will. She had felt his sorrow when burying his father's things, the joy in his eyes when he was with the pineapples, the delight and care he took with his drawings, and the hope for a better life. There had to be a way of stopping the police from charging him, for she knew deep in her bones that he was truly innocent. She needed to be a detective, like the Earls had said, and find some firm evidence that proved Robert was the thief. Something small and light plopped onto her apron. A little green caterpillar. It wriggled on its back, its legs waving feebly in the air. Clara gently rolled it over and held it in her fingers. Hello, you, she said. The caterpillar cautiously clambered aboard and inched towards her wrist. Clara heard the front door of the bothy open. Robert came out and sat on the front step. He leaned against the brick wall, tipped his head back and closed his eyes, his hands gripping his knees tightly. He had seemed so nice when she had first arrived, with his talk of visiting faraway places where the pineapples were grown. She had thought he had been protecting Will by hiding him in the boiler house, when instead his intentions had been so cruel. Anger curled underneath her skin. The caterpillar's feet tickled Clara's arms. It would be finding a place to build its chrysalis soon, to turn into something else entirely and fly away. Clara blinked. Something clicked in her head, like a key being turned. Her thoughts gathered speed, pieces of the puzzle clinking into place. The bothy was quiet. The gardeners up at the big house having tea. Will had said Robert shared a room on the ground floor with some of the other under-gardeners, and this was where she found herself. She crept along the hall, pulled a door latch, and peered inside. 3 beds, with a small table next to each. A deep sickness welled in the pit of her stomach. If she was right, this would change everything for Will, and for Robert. She walked swiftly to the first table. On top lay a gardening manual, a notebook, and a pencil. It was the same style of notebook Will had, blue with a bound edge. She flicked through it. The book belonged to a man called George and contained lists of gardening jobs. She turned to the next table. The top of this one was clear. She opened the small drawer beneath it and felt around inside. It was empty. She frowned. Whoever slept in that bed had no personal possessions, unless they did but wanted to hide them. Clara turned to the bed and lifted the corners of her mattress. The bed frame creaked loudly. She paused and glanced at the door. The hallway was still quiet. There was nothing under the bed. She thought of the seam of her own mattress, which had come undone so readily when she had looked for a secret hiding place. She bent down and smoothed her hand around the outside. Nothing. Frustration billowed through her. It had to be in here somewhere. She cast her eyes around the room. There, on the back of the door, Robert's gardening jacket with its distinctive mustard yellow lining, hanging in plain sight. Clara took it down from the hook and felt inside the pockets. They were empty. She patted the jacket down. There was a rustle. Something was hidden in the lining. She reached into the right pocket again and turned it inside out. There was a small hole which had been roughly sewn up, as if it had been mended and undone several times. Clara's jaw tightened. She pulled the stitching apart and gingerly felt inside. Papers. She gave them a tug and they slipped out. She turned the papers over in her hand, the meaning of them slowly dawning on her. She remembered what the Earl had said. This was good evidence, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She glanced out of the window. The sky was darkening. The gardeners would be returning from the big house soon. The plan was bubbling. A way to catch Robert and make him confess of his crimes. She just hoped it would work out, for Will's future depended on it. We'll read a bit more. Chapter 37. Courage. Clara watched the bats sweeping in the early evening dark as she approached the stables. The days and the nights were cooling as October marched towards the chill of winter. The bats would be hibernating soon, tucking themselves away from the cold in barns and attics. Like the bats, Clara knew her time at Gardener's Cottage was speeding towards an end, and to a new beginning of sorts, back home with her family and friends. But she could not and would not go until she had done everything in her power to help Will. He had no one else in the world to look out for him now, no mother or father to welcome him home at the end of a day, no brother to rely on when times were tough, no bed of his own to sleep in at night. Robert's paper burned a hole in her pockets as she pulled on the stable door. A cart loaded with vegetables was locked inside. Somehow this wasn't very surprising. She saw a figure approaching. "Clara," Robert said in surprise. What are you doing here? Clara summoned all her courage. She imagined drawing it up from a well, buckets and buckets of it. She pulled her shoulders back. Mr. Gilbert asked me to go with you tonight to take the vegetables to the hospital. Robert frowned. Really? But he told me to take them tomorrow. There's an emergency, a food shortage, Clara said lightly. Robert's brow furrowed. I overheard him telling Mrs. Gilbert what a hard worker you are. You're his favourite of all the undergardeners. I think he may even pay you a little extra this week. This is all a make-up lie. Robert's good eye, was as shiny as a spoon. Really? Clara nodded, trying to quell the rising nausea at telling such a lie. Clara had not been along the country lane at night before. Robert steered the horse deftly through the dark, like he had done this journey many times. Clara wondered exactly how many times as she buried her hands under the rug covering their knees. Rage tingled at the tips of her fingers. The rage translated into words she could not have kept from the rising in her throat. Have you seen Will? She asked. Kitty's hooves clip-clopped on the road. The wind whistled around their heads, flickering strands of Clara's hair into her eyes. No, Robert said in a curt voice. He's been taken into town, to the police station. Clara thought of her own brother, how terrified she had been of him being injured, how she had been powerless to support him, and couldn't bear to think of him at all for a long time. You should help your brother. He needs you. Things are complicated, Robert said in a thin voice, as the sequin-like lights of the town pushed through the inky blackness. Why? Clara persisted, but Robert did not respond, just stared straight ahead. More words fizzed into her throat, accusing words. She squashed them down. She must not confront Robert yet, not until she had firm proof that he had been taking the fruit. Smoke curled from the chimney of the hospital into the dark. A man and a lady walked past with a small dog, out for an early evening stroll. The dog barked as Robert drew back on the reins and brought Kitty to a slow stop. Clara hopped down from the cart and stroked Kitty's flank. She was warm, breath steaming from her nose. She nodded her head, as if glad to have arrived. Clara tied Kitty to a lamppost and helped Robert unload the wooden crates of vegetables, stacking them on the roadside. As Robert disappeared through the hospital entrance, carrying 2 of the crates, Clara lifted the corner of the cloth covering a crate still in the back of the cart, potatoes and carrots. In another were tightly packed beetroots and leeks. Her fingers moved quickly and lightly across the crates, lifting the cloths and making a mental note of the contents. There were no pineapples, no figs or peaches. Clara sighed, picked up one of the smaller crates and walked into the hospital entrance. Maybe she had been wrong after all. A nurse in white uniform came through the door just as Clara was wondering how to open it and hold the crate at the same time. She gave Clara a bright smile. Food delivery? Clara nodded and rushed past her down the corridor, the smell of disinfectant sticking in her throat. Robert walked past her in the opposite direction, 2 empty crates from the previous delivery in his arms. He gave her a quick nod. In the kitchen store, a lady was unloading the boxes Robert had delivered. Is this the last of them? She asked. I think there are a few more, said Clara, putting her crate down. Where was Robert? She listened for the echo of the heavy boots in the corridor, but it was quiet. Clara half ran back to the hospital entrance. She flung open the doors and stood on the pavement. Kitty was still standing contently, her nose in a bag of hay, her tail flicked. The last of the boxes were standing on the pavement, waiting to be brought inside. Where had Robert gone? Clara peered down the street to her left. Empty. She swung round to her right. Also empty. Standing quietly, she let the sounds and sights of the town settling down for the night fill up her senses. The clunk of a window being shut, the swish of the curtains being pulled, a drifting smell of something sweet, like milky cocoa, a mother standing in an open doorway, a swaddled but fretful baby wriggling in her arms. Then, to the right, on the opposite side of the road in the shadows, she noticed a figure. Clara peered into the darkness. Could it be him? She began to run down the long street, her feet light and quiet on the paving slabs. The figure slank into the gloom and reappeared under a pool of light from a street lamp. His head was bent forward and he was carrying a parcel. Robert. Clara crossed the street and picked up her pace, her eyes never leaving the back. Where was he going? Boom! The noise was like a loud thunderclap. Clara pressed on. A sudden storm was the last thing she needed. If the pavements were slick with rain and the air misty, she might lose the sight of Robert altogether. Boom! 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 The glass in the window of the terrace house Clara was passing rattled and shook. Her feet came to a sudden halt. A strange mechanical, whirling noise came from the sky. A couple of front doors opened, pale faces peering out into the night. How very odd, Clara thought, as people clapped their hands to their mouths, which were opened so wide it was a wonder their faces didn't crack apart. There came a sound of slapping feet on the pavement running towards her. Zeppelin! A boy said in a shrill voice as his blurry body ran past. Zeppelin attack! Take shelter! Remember the big flying airships that dropped the bombs. Doors were opening. People were leaving their houses, running down the streets toward the hospital, in the direction Clara had just come from. A father carried a small girl in a nightdress, whose head was tipped towards the sky. I see it, Papa! It's there! Look! Clara slowly looked up, in the direction of the noisy whirling. A long, silver cigar-shaped balloon loomed in the sky ahead. The hair at the nape of her neck lifted, and she swallowed a scream. Her feet rooted to the spot. And we're going to leave it there. So she's out in the streets in the middle of the night, trying to chase Robert, who's running away with a parcel. But there's now a Zeppelin attack, so they would be really needing to be run to their Anderson shelters. But we're going to leave it there. It'll be the last time next time.